Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast, a show for people who are big on cities but short on time. I'm Vanessa Quirk. Eric, we finally launched our podcast today. It is launch day. What are you going to do to celebrate?
I think this calls for a shot of Purell.
This is the saddest shot that there may be.
I know it's early for a shot, but I'm not driving. So, I mean, it feels like the spirit of the day.
I mean, it might be a necessary one considering how small and compact this little booth is.
Would you like a shot of Purell?
You know what? I would love one.
All right, here we go. Hello, city lovers. Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly. I'm Eric Jaffe. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the biggest stories from the urban tech world. Our first segment looks at 3 top stories. We'll give them 5 minutes each. And when time's up, you're going to hear a little bicycle bell.
Bing.
This week, we'll talk about South Korea's fantastic composting program, Tulsa's intriguing remote worker program, and whether or not life in quarantine would really be all that different than it is today.
All right, let's get into the composting stuff.
Composting first. Yeah, this is a wonderful story from Rivka Galchin. She's writing in The New Yorker, and she explores this fantastic transformation that South Korea has made where it now recycles 95% of its organic food waste. This is from, 25 years ago, it recycled virtually none of its organic food waste. Again, a really remarkable turnaround. Vanessa, what accounts for this?
So before we dive into South Korea specifically, let's just back up a little bit and explain why composting matters, if you will. Most cities, especially in the U.S., have a lot of trouble with recycling and specifically with composting because it adds on an additional complication. You might need different trucks to come and pick it up. It's heavy. And from a city perspective, the reason why it's so important to deal properly with organic food waste is because when it goes to landfill, it decomposes, it releases methane, right? And methane is a greenhouse gas. Its climate impact is about 56 times more potent than carbon dioxide.
Right, so this is really dangerous.
Super dangerous. So obviously it has to take priority when we're talking about recycling. We can't just forget about organic waste, especially because organic waste will often end up contaminating recycling, making your recycling rates go lower. So it's a thorny problem, a tricky one. South Korea really took an innovative approach from the beginning. I mean, back in 1995, South Korea started thinking about this way before it was on the map of most cities.
Yeah, and what they really did that was innovative here is that they kind of had policy and technology working together to attack this problem. So you mentioned 1995. They launched a new system at that time. It's basically what we know today as a pay-as-you-throw system. So the way it works is it's free to recycle, but it costs you money to throw out things in a landfill. They charge you per bag. And so the incentive there is obviously to make sure you recycle. Now, you have to make sure people are recycling properly. That's part of it. But this gets people thinking about recycling and the need for the accountability in their own household. Now, on the flip side, you have to say, okay, but how do we make it easier for people to recycle? That's kind of where the tech comes in. Today in Korea, they've got these smart composting bins all over the place outside buildings. So you take this little card that identifies you, that tells the bin who you are. The lid opens up automatically. You put in your composting waste. It weighs it. It's got separate areas for things like cooking oil that have to actually be handled separately. And then you're done. You've got your composting done. And there is a little bit of a charge today. It comes to something about $6 a month. So it's no longer free. Yeah, okay. It's no longer free. But what this does, this kind of marriage of policy and technology, it really incentivizes people to recycle properly, and it gives them the ability to recycle easily.
I think what's pretty remarkable about South Korea specifically, too, is that this has been successful in really dense cities, which is pretty unusual in the rest of the world. Like, when you look at North America has also rolled out some pay-as-you-throw programs over the years, and they have been successful, but usually only in single-family homes. I think there's a few reasons for that. It's a bit less complex.
Right. You just put your trash out on the curb and everybody knows it's your trash.
Right. And I think part of the reason why it's been successful is because it's very easy to communicate back if you're recycling properly, if you're putting your organic waste in the right place. I've heard of programs where you just put like a little tag on the bin and say like, hi, this was incorrect. This is what should be in your recycling. And so the feedback and communication is quite direct. When you have folks in multifamily, residential buildings, apartment buildings, then you're just putting your trash in a chute and there's kind of no accountability nor information being sent to you as the individual about how well you're recycling and how it's impacting your building overall. So, I mean, at Sidewalk, we've been thinking about this a lot. we've actually rolled out a recycling pilot program in a building in Toronto, which is underway now. It'll be really cool to see the results. But we're just helping people to let them know, hi, yeah, this is recyclable. Good job. Or, you know what? No, it's not, or it's contaminated or whatever.
Right.
And we're really looking forward to see the results of that pilot to see, well, with that communication, will people change their behavior and will they be able to recycle better?
Again, the idea is to make it super easy for people.
All right, well, let's move into our next story. This one comes from Sarah Holder, writing at City Lab. She's writing about this program. Pretty interesting stuff. It's called the Great Tulsa Remote Worker Experiment, which sounds very grand, doesn't it?
It's a movie title.
Yeah. Basically, Tulsa is paying a bunch of people to come move to Tulsa, work remotely. Let's say their job is based in, the Bay Area, but they can work remotely from Tulsa. Why not? And then they get about $10,000 to help with moving costs. They get options for housing, maybe some subsidies on housing, lots of community perks and community meetings and these kinds of things. Many are finding it incredibly appealing. Many people are actually staying in Tulsa. Eric, when are you packing your bags?
Well, not just yet, but I think this is a really fascinating way to deal with population loss, which is kind of the crux of this story and the impetus for this program here.
Right.
Tulsa lost a lot of people over the last couple years, 2017, 2018. Their population is declining. A lot of local jobs had closed up. That means a lower tax base. And it's funny, there was a related story this week in the Wall Street Journal about how kind of a number of cities, a lot of them in the Midwest, again, they're losing their tax base, they're losing populations, and they're finding they can't pay for really critical municipal services anymore. And I think this is kind of the crux of the issue that inspired this program in Tulsa. And when you think about it, I mean, we worry a lot. We're here in New York. We worry a lot about too much wealth being concentrated in coastal cities now and the growth kind of not being equitable for everybody. Yeah. These are really legitimate concerns, but we can't forget the flip side of this coin, which is that in a place like Tulsa, if you're losing population, that comes with potentially concentrated poverty, potentially job loss, an inability for the government to cover, say, pensions of people who've worked their whole lives to earn a living in retirement. And so there are challenges at both ends. What Tulsa's saying is that we want growth because at least when you're growing economically, you have a chance to redistribute more equitably.
Right. So what's intriguing about this plan to me is how it's in contrast to several other ways that cities have been going about this very problem, but in different ways. So we can think about when Amazon did that HQ2 search and cities kind of bent over backwards to offer, tax incentives to this business because they knew that would bring jobs and potentially opportunity. But as we've seen, as it kind of plays out, tax incentives aren't always the best route. They don't always end up having the outcomes that were desired from the first place, right? And they're not always allowing for equitable growth. We'll talk about this later, but Reno is having problems with this right now. They open their doors to companies like Tesla, and they didn't necessarily think ahead to, what about affordable housing, right? So you've got to figure out how to take those investments to the advantage of more people, right? Not just some. So what's cool about Tulsa is they decided not to go that route, and they're saying, let's invest in individuals rather than huge companies, which is a really neat way to go about it. And they're also going about it with investing in their city so that it'll be more attractive to those people, which is really cool. I mean, they're investing in art. They're investing in their parks. New breweries are popping up, I guess, very typical of this millennial scene, right? But it's working, and people are ending up staying. Some of them might put down roots. Some of them are already buying houses, starting families, and they're creating a community that they felt that they lacked in coastal cities. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and I think we should clarify that there's nothing wrong with a city kind of encouraging businesses to start. I think the point you're making and the important distinction is when you start giving huge tax breaks to businesses, especially businesses that might otherwise have moved to a city, that's when you really start getting into a dangerous area of kind of undermining your own public policy objectives as a city. I think what was really interesting about this is that Tulsa is kind of doubling down on the belief that people will telecommute more and will thrive at work while telecommuting. And there was the stat from the census here in the story saying that telecommuting was the fastest growing commute mode and that it had kind of grown by 150% over the past few years. But the truth is it's still a really small share of the overall workforce. It's 3%, still really small. So we don't know if that is true, that thesis is true, but I think Tulsa's really testing it.
Not just Tulsa, I mean, like, even the country of Estonia, they've been working on this philosophy for a few years. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if those bets pay off in the long run, if they can grow their population in that way.
All right, our last top story for today comes from Ian Bogost. He's writing at The Atlantic, and he says, we don't need to wonder what life would be like in a mass quarantine, say, as a result of coronavirus, because between Netflix and on-demand delivery, we're kind of already there. So, Vanessa, do you feel quarantined in your everyday life outside of this little podcast booth, that is?
No, I don't yet. Of course, things could change. This is a rapidly evolving story. For me personally, a pretty anxiety-inducing story, the spread of the coronavirus. And what will it mean for our daily life? I mean, obviously, some companies are already starting to encourage people to work from home. Events are being canceled. And so it's just all measures to try and help people avoid getting infected when we still know so little about how this disease is being spread or passed on, right? So Ian Bogus kind of takes the response that, like, oh, who cares if we're going to get quarantined and stay at home all the time? I do that already. He's noticing how these quote-unquote stay-at-home stocks are shooting up. Netflix, Peloton, Zoom, which is a teleconference company. And he just writes, for years, contemporary society has just been bracing, even longing for quarantine. So for him, he's kind of taking the silver lining perspective here that, we're finally getting what we wished for with all of these technologies, which, I don't know, I have mixed feelings about. How did you feel about this piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think what excited me most about this piece was actually your headline in the weekly email newsletter, which was keep calm and Netflix on.
Right.
So I think that kind of, that's fantastic in and of itself.
Thank you.
I think it's really interesting to hear Ian talk about this and kind of come up with this hypothesis. I think it is a little overblown, right? I mean, because you could take this to mean basically, why do we need cities anymore? And that is not a new argument. In fact, that's when computers were first emerging and when the notion of telecommuting was first emerging. You're talking 70s and 80s, this stuff was starting to get bigger and bigger. These were stories we used to hear all the time of, like, actually, cities are going to be obsolete because people can just sit in their homes and they can do whatever they want remotely and digitally. And we know now that not only was this not true, the reverse happened, right? In the 1990s and the 2000s, you started to see cities start to recover population. A lot of people moved back into cities who had been gone for years and years and years in the suburbs. And, that brought along a lot of the challenges we're facing today. But it was not the end of cities in terms of people being interested in living near each other, living near urban communities, having proximity to things they like to do every day, like shopping, like going out to eat, like hanging out in their community spaces. And, there's been a lot of research that's shown this proximity to amenities, this ability to walk, not have to get in your car and drive somewhere every time you want to do something. This is what brings people to cities and makes them enjoy urban life, that street life that we always talk about on the sidewalks. And that's not going away, right? It's a little tense right now with coronavirus, but it's not going away. And so I think you kind of have to have that historical perspective to think about as well.
When you think just about the rise of co-working spaces, right? I mean, it's pretty remarkable to think about the fact that all those folks that are working in there, they could be working from home, but they chose to be in a space with other people. And I think that we're going to see this tension continue to play out between isolating at home versus interacting with people. I actually think there's a case to be made that because we're going to be isolating more at home, we're going to seek out people more. Yeah. So I mean, that seems to be the trend right now. We'll see. One thing I did want to point out about this piece that kind of rubbed me the wrong way is that Ian here is clearly speaking to a very small audience. Like you mentioned, only about 3% of people work remotely right now. A lot of people in the quote-unquote creative class have the luxury of working remotely whenever they so choose, but there are a lot of people in cities that don't have that luxury, whose jobs involve interacting with people on a daily basis, which is quite scary with the coronavirus kind of spreading so quickly.
Right. You're talking about service workers, restaurant workers, teachers.
Delivery. Yeah. When we read about a couple weeks ago about the delivery drivers of Wuhan, there was a great New York Times article about that. I mean, they have to get out there so that people who are quarantined can keep living. So I think that the story kind of glosses over that a little bit too much for my liking, but I still thought it was an entertaining read and an interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, that wasn't his focus, but I think it needs to be the focus of cities, especially high-impact infected cities at this point. What is the safety net going to be for those groups? Yeah. We need them. What can cities do for small businesses as well that need to stay open? These are really things that cities need to be focusing on.
Right. I mean, gig economy workers have notoriously lacked a safety net, so it's only going to become more important over time with this virus. So, well, that is it for the top stories. As always, you can find the links to these stories in our podcast episode notes. In our next segment, we're going to play a game called Taking the Local.
Choo-choo.
Cue that choo-choo sound. The idea is to hear about a local urban tech issue through the voices of people who live there. So we're going to read out loud some quotes from the story, and we're going to talk about how those perspectives fit into larger urban trends.
All right, so this week we are going to take the local to Reno, Nevada, where Patrick Sisson, he's writing in Curbed, is talking all about how Reno and its adjacent area called Sparks, they gave some big incentives a few years ago to Tesla so that it could set up its Gigafactory, right? This is a big manufacturing plant for batteries.
Huge plant.
Yeah. And they gave it $1.3 billion in tax breaks to move there. It was very controversial at the time. It really remains that way. And as a kind of result of some of that growth and those decisions, the housing market in Reno is rising, but a lot of residents are feeling the crunch and finding it harder to find an affordable place to live. So let's start this story kind of through the lens of someone who supported the move of Tesla to Reno Sparks. This is Mike Kazmierski, the president and CEO of the Economic Development Authority of Western Nevada. And he says, those tech employees have different expectations of a downtown. They want that cool millennial feel. These are people who want to ski in the morning and then work at the downtown tech startup.
Right. It's kind of reminiscent of the Tulsa story a little bit, trying to rebrand your neighborhoods and towns so that it is more appealing to a certain demographic of high-earning millennials, basically. All right, let's move on to the next quote here, a different perspective. This is Brent Boynton. So he is the community outreach coordinator at the Reno Housing Authority. He says, in a tight market, the pressure falls upon those least able to afford it. If one of our clients' rent goes up at $200 a month, they may be homeless. So clearly he's emphasizing here the stakes involved. It's not just that the rents are rising. You know, the folks that he works with on a daily basis, they may no longer have a home as a result.
Yeah, and I think what this speaks to is that one of the reasons people are so opposed to tax incentives for big companies to move there is because it limits the city's ability to fund really important programs around, say, things like affordable housing, right? You don't really want to pay companies to move there, right? You don't want to give them massive tax breaks to move there because in many cases they're going to move there on their own. And that's kind of, again, undermining the public objectives that you have around growth.
Right. And the price increases are pretty significant. I mean, apartments that were $800 a month about 4 years ago, now they're $1,200. That is significant, right? And it really makes me think that companies and public sector, they really need to be focused on housing from the beginning, way before they even set up shop.
Yeah. So our next quote's going to come from Jeremy Aguero. He's a principal at Applied Analysis. That's an economic consultancy with an office in Reno. And Jeremy says, quote, I think oftentimes people forget the struggle the Reno Sparks area had a decade ago. It seems like a long time ago now, but as a result of the policies that helped bring tech here, it changed the momentum for the region.
Mm-hmm. It's easy to dwell on the issues and problems of the current moment, but when you take a longer-term perspective, you can kind of see the positive side of that growth and adjustment, right? I mean, in the past, Reno had not a great reputation as a city, right?
Right. It was called, I think, by one article in 2015, officially the most depressing place on earth.
Reno's entire economy kind of depended on the gambling industry. That was its lifeblood, right? So there is a lot of wisdom in diversifying the industry in a city. And to be fair, it's not just tech that they've been trying to incentivize to come. You know, there's medical device makers there now. There's different options. And it has been effective in that there's more than 14,500 jobs that have been created there in Reno in the last 5 years. That is pretty significant.
Right. And a lot of those are very high-paying jobs, and they are not all tech jobs, to your point. I mean, there's starting to get a little bit of a diversity of industries. And so, you know, there really is more economic opportunity in Reno than there was even just a few years ago.
All right, we're going to wrap up this segment with our final quote from Anjanette Damon. She's a reporter for the Reno Gazette-Journal. She's also the co-host of an amazing podcast called The City, which really kind of unpacks a lot of these issues that we've been talking about, so definitely check it out. She says, there's a lot of people who kind of would say, I miss the Reno that used to be when it was easy to afford to live here. The flip side was there weren't as many job opportunities. It's the same question so many cities are grappling with. How do you make sure all that growth is equitable and everyone gets a piece of the success?
This is really a fantastic quote from Anjanette. I mean, you can't possibly summarize really the current situation in cities around the world any better than that.
Agreed, and we'll end it there on a high note. So it is now time for our final segment, The Last Smile. In this segment, we set aside all the depressing news of the week, and we focus on something that made us happy for a minute each. Eric, what made you smile this week?
All right, you're going to force me to be happy this week. Fine.
As I always do.
And what did make me happy was reading this story from Lisa Wood Shapiro in Wired. So Lisa's writing about her experience. She was one of those kind of really famous fast New York walkers, took a lot of pride in it for years and years. And then she got sick. And for a long period of time, she wasn't able, physically to walk as fast. And she started walking really slowly, but she started looking around on the sidewalk and she started appreciating new things. And she writes at one point, those who marched with me at our careful gait knew the secrets of this slower town, right? She kind of started seeing her own city in a different way, almost started resenting the fast walkers. And I thought this was just kind of a really lovely perspective. I mean, this happens to me actually a couple times a year when I have terrible eyesight and I go to the doctor and they dilate my pupils and I have to leave. And you really you have to take it really, really slowly. You can't cross the street, the willy-nilly the way you might normally do it. And you really start to see the city in a different way. Lisa describes that beautifully.
Yeah, really beautifully well-written article and a really nice sentiment to smile upon,
There you go.
Eric.
All right, what has you smiling, Vanessa?
I enjoyed this article, The Rogue Plaque Maker of Central Park here. This is in Vice by Aaron Gordon.
Fantastic title.
Yes, definitely great. So Aaron is strolling through Central Park in New York and he comes across a plaque that says, Stephen R. is not dead. He just loves plaques. And he tweets it, and shockingly, Stephen R. responds, hey, that's my plaque. And you get into this whole amazing saga of the lengths that Stephen R. was willing to go through to get this plaque up in Central Park. And eventually, Aaron starts kind of tweeting about plaques more generally, and really just kind of having a bit of a thoughtful conversation amidst this very funny story about, what are plaques for? What do they memorialize? They kind of remind you that the city was there before you. It'll continue after you. And so it kind of had like little moments of profundity there, as well as very funny jokes. So I would definitely recommend that. It definitely made me smile this week.
Two strolling stories, really, right? You have to be walking slowly to appreciate a nice bench plaque.
Well, maybe it's just, in the midst of all this corona craziness, we just need to take the time to appreciate the little things.
All right, well, the little things are done for today. Our time is up. Thank you for joining us.
If you want to read the stories that we discussed today and many more, you should sign up for the Sidewalk Weekly newsletter at sidewalklabs.com.
We should note that the views expressed in the Sidewalk Weekly podcast don't necessarily reflect Sidewalk Labs' company positions.
That's right. And if you think that we are missing a perspective, then let us know. Send us an email with a note or a voice memo to podcast@sidewalklabs.com, and we might just talk about it in a future episode.
The Sidewalk Weekly is produced by Vanessa and me, but Vanessa does the editing. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and our art is by the great Tim Cow.
See you next time.
Bye.